Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today to this important webinar where we'll delve into the world of accountable capitalism. There is no doubt that ESG considerations are transforming industries and reshaping corporate priorities, forcing today's leaders to stay at the cutting edge of ESG's contextual changes and organizational strategic outlook. Today, Wharton assembled a distinguished panel of executives and researchers to share both their practical knowledge and research insight in the ESG field. I invite you to type in your questions in the chat window. Please identify the panelists you will be addressing the question to. There will be time dedicated at the end of the live event to go through as many questions as possible. I also would like to say that the views expressed in this event represent the panelists' opinions and do not necessarily represent the position of their respective organizations. So without further ado, let's dive in with our moderator and speaker for today's webinar, Professor Viet Hennisch. Viet is Wharton Vice Dean and Professor Director and Faculty Director of the ESG Initiative at the Wharton School. He's also the founder of our Wharton ESG Executive Program Series and Deloitte & Touche Professor of Management. Viet, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Vita, and thanks to all who are interested in this important and timely topic. The news today from the front lines for the battle of accountable capitalism is decidedly mixed. Let's start with the demand from investors. On the one hand, we often hear statistics organized by institutions like the Global Sustainable Investment Alliance that tout $35 trillion, or 36% of all globally professionally managed assets, incorporate or demand environmental, social, or governance factors be included in their investment thesis, and that this number is growing 13% per annum for almost a decade and should continue to grow because millennials and Gen Xers care more about ESG factors than baby boomers and more mature asset owners. Bloomberg even reported that the expected demand for ESG investing was going to be $50 trillion as soon as 2025. On the other hand, some of these industry estimates of assets under management for ESG have been halved in recent years using more realistic or conservative definitions. And a recent academic paper by my colleague in the Wharton Finance Department, Luke Taylor and Bob Stambaugh, analyzed the actual tilt away from benchmark portfolios in those ESG investment strategies and conclude that the actual amount of ESG investing maybe is $2 or maybe $3 trillion. Let's turn next to the supply of consultants, the people who are going to enable companies to engage in ESG strategies. PwC once announced with much fanfare plans to hire 100,000 sustainability consultants over 5 years. On the other hand, the number of undergraduate MBA students globally reporting deferrals of their consulting jobs by 3, 6, or even 9 months is really sobering, especially in the sustainability space. What about strategists and board members, corporate leaders? CEOs and boards report to McKinsey and BOD that ESG factors are a number 1 or number 2 strategic concern. More than 60% of them now have ESG factors incorporated into their compensation plans, according to a survey by Korn Ferry. However, those incentives are typically focused only on carbon emissions, and they represent at most a few percent of potential earnings. The evidence that these ESG factors are driving change, launching new products, transforming companies, while often heard on the ski slopes of Davos, is a little less apparent in the data, the workplaces, and the discourses on firms and capitalism more broadly. Putting all this together, is the movement for accountable capitalism making substantive advances in increasing the transparency of externalities imposed or created by business models? Are governments, financiers, and employers taking note? Or is the ESG movement in retreat against an onslaught of evidence that its data and analysis to date do not help identify value creation or protection opportunities, and thus, as suggested by critics on the right, impose undue burdens on firms, or as suggested by critics on the left, distract us from the need to implement more rigorous policy reform? What's next? Will we find better data, build better models, and drive substantive change? Will we see less lofty claims, but no change in effort, in which companies avoid using the label ESG, but continue to pursue meaningful reform? Or will the current headwinds lead to delays and tactical retreats that reverse progress and taint the ESG movement as just another fad? To avoid getting bogged down in debates over definitions, the participants to this panel have jointly agreed to define accountable capitalism as a system in which stakeholders hold organizations accountable for the externalities they create, thereby better aligning long-term value created and distributed with the short-term incentives faced by financiers, resource owners, managers, and workers. ESG factors offer a framework of measurement that, if well designed and implemented, offers signals regarding the magnitude and nature of these externalities, thereby facilitating either ex-ante pricing by the government or ex-post pricing by financiers and other stakeholders. I'm thrilled to lead this conversation with 4 leaders engaged in this topic from different sectors. First, Jennifer Grancio, CEO of Engine No. 1, an investment firm purpose-built to create long-term value, who has 25 years of experience scaling businesses across financial services that have a positive impact for investors, including being a founding member of BlackRock's iShares business. Next, Monica Dimitrakopoulos, EY America's sustainability leader, who drives sustainable growth for clients, people, and communities, and previously served as EY's global long-term value leader. Viviana Alvarez, formerly head of corporate strategy for Unilever in the US, and also head of sustainability for Unilever North America, currently at the University of California, Berkeley. And finally, my colleague Arthur Van Bentham, co-director of the Wharton School's Climate Center and associate professor of business economics and public policy, with a research portfolio that explores the impact intended and unintended of various policy responses to societal threats such as climate change. Let's start right away with your own perspective on the front lines of accountable capitalism. What's happening right now? Who's winning and why? And what are your long and short-term forecasts for progress? Let's start with the financial service perspective from Jennifer.
Vic, I think Jennifer's on mute.
Okay, Jennifer, I'm sorry. I think you're on mute on your end.
All right, I'm not now. That's a pretty classic problem. Well, I apologize for that.
Let's start again. So Jennifer, the question was, what's happening on the front lines of accountable capitalism in the financial service sector? Who do you think is winning and why?
Thank you, Veet. Yeah, I mean, I think who wins and who loses, we need to get this right pretty quickly, or sort of all American investors lose, and that would be a really bad outcome. So we started Engine No. 1 a couple of years ago, really to try to drive a middle road in the conversation around, we think capitalism works. We think capitalism was always meant to be long-term, and we think that everybody loses if we have sort of an ideological conversation where we don't go deep enough into what are the risk factors, what does the data tell us? Because as investors, so investment-led firms and fiduciaries and asset managers like ourselves, we should always be able to separate out where is there economic data about governance. Governance always matters. About climate and emissions and climate impact, and on the human capital side. We should be able as investors to use data, and if we don't have it and can't do it, we should be looking for more data and better ways. We should always be able to drive, have a point of view on what's causal in terms of long-term economic returns. So from a losing perspective, I think our dialogue today is shallow, it's not data rich, it's too short-term at a kind of American public level. That has to change or we all lose. From a winning and what have we proven and where can we jump off of perspective, I think we're seeing great conversations about this data being data that is risk and financial data and should be incorporated in investments. So that's great. That's very productive. I think we're having good conversations about the difference between data from an investment perspective that is economically causal and we can link to performance, and then other data, which is values-based. And that's not bad. Those are just two different things. There's some data that we can prove it's causal to returns. There's other data where we can kind of point to it and say that it's values-based. And I think we're seeing rapid improvements in data. So the more data we have, the more research that's done on the back of it. I think that's what we've already seen in the market is a win. And the more data and the more research we have, I'm going to count all of those as wins, because then that can make this a kind of an intellectually informed conversation about how an asset owner focuses on long-term returns and values-based investing. As well as how corporates and companies sort of show up and manage their companies for returns for their shareholders.
Thanks, Jennifer. Monica, do you share that enthusiasm about our clients demanding more of these services? How fast is EY able to meet those demands, and what's the future hold on the front lines?
Yeah, so thanks, Vit, for having all of us join, into the audience for participating in this important discussion today. We see that our clients are in very different places with respect to both their maturity and openness when it comes to embracing accountable capitalism and what it means for their business. I think if you want to simplify it, you can think about companies falling into one of three categories. At one end of the spectrum, the more mature end of the spectrum, you see companies that are truly differentiating themselves and driving innovation with a clear sense of what their stakeholders expect of them, going far beyond just their shareholders. At the other end of the spectrum, you still see companies that are playing defense, companies that are essentially managing risk and ensuring that they're meeting regulatory expectations, but not going much beyond that. And then in the middle, you have the bulk of the companies probably where they've defined a set of ESG initiatives that they're pursuing, but still have some work to do in terms of embedding this squarely in their strategy and operations. And in that context, if you look at, to answer your question about who are the winners, the companies that get this right do 5 things. And I recognize that's a lot, but let me list them. I mean, what they generally are doing is deepening their understanding of stakeholder expectations. I'm going to come back to this point because I think it's probably the most important of all the points to consider. They are putting in place the right governance at the board and executive leadership team levels. They're embedding this as a lens into how they think about their strategic priorities and growth agenda. They're essentially moving toward operationalizing these initiatives and allocating the right amounts of capital. And they're staying very connected to the market, to their stakeholders, transparently reporting on progress or lack thereof, to Jennifer's point, improving the quality of the data and what they can share on this basis. But I think that first point is the most important one, which is knowing your stakeholders, knowing their expectations, but importantly, not just those expectations because they're not all created equal, but those that matter the most for your organization's future success, and thinking about how to prioritize those is what sets apart the companies that are doing this well. And I think that as we look ahead, this is only going to become more important if you think about the number of geopolitical, environmental, and climate-related issues, social issues that companies need to face, kind of embracing a very clear sense of stakeholder expectations and what it takes to be successful is what is going to differentiate the winners that can drive growth, reduce risk, attract investment and talent in the future.
Thanks, Monica. Viviana, I think by any standard, your former employer Unilever is often listed as one of those winners, one of the companies that figured this out first under the leadership of Paul Polman. What do you see in the corporate space in terms of uptick of some of the lessons from Unilever? What's happening? How many followers are there? And what else would you like to add from the corporate perspective on the front lines of accountable capitalism?
Well, the good news, Vits, and thank you for this panel, is that it's not just the Unilevers of the world. Thankfully, there's more than the Unilevers, and that's, I think, the key part. I want to just quickly mention the link with the other 2 questions. I completely agree with Jennifer and Monica that we either all lose and all win, because even if we add up all the commitments of the Unilevers and many other organizations that are now making tangible steps towards this journey, it's simply not enough. I do believe we are in a very serious tipping point in where we have already surpassed even circular economy's projections, where we are consuming and producing more than we literally have on planetary boundaries. So capitalism is a gigantic engine that we all have to tweak and adapt to our current world. I mean, we have, yes, players like Unilever, Patagonia, and many other progressive organizations, and not just them, people realizing that commodities and everything in the multi-stakeholder model is at stake. So when you see this from the outside world of Unilever, even if all in aggregate deliver the targets, is simply not enough. But what it also means is that there's so many opportunities. Unilever was the first among others in their industry to open the way to show that not only business is profitable while you are doing the right thing, it's incredibly more resilient. And we have many examples of that. And I'm happy to quote examples like, Ben & Jerry's, one of the most challenging and progressive brands with regards to topics like this. They grew 30% in the last 5 years. They're now a $1 billion brand. So there's many examples that even to the extreme on how they're advocating for a lot of these topics are incredibly successful. Just Capital report, they take in aggregate who are really the companies that are taking a multi-stakeholder view, not just shareholder. And guess what? They all outperform the markets. And when crises come, let's take the example of the pandemic. This was a very good acid test. You could see really the resilience of company who has not only strong relationships with the suppliers and the entire value chains, but also how can they respond to things that we know might be possible happening in the future, whether if it's a pandemic or other things that are disrupting the business. When you have resilience in your P&L with your employees and all of these externalities, this is a ginormous opportunity and flexibility that you have to operate in these cases.
Thanks, Vivi. Let's turn from the private sector over to the public sector. Arthur, what's your take on how the policy environment, both in the US, the European Union, is helping enable more accountable systems of capitalism?
Right. So to an economist, as you said, Vit, accountable capitalism means pricing externalities correctly. And I also would like to echo what Viviana said, right? It's not that capitalism is broken per se, but it needs to be steered such that companies pay for the full societal damages that they create. So the question is, how do we internalize externalities? And clearly, the most direct way is through pricing carbon in some fashion, or other pollutants for that matter, with a tax or with tradable permits in a carbon market. Now, that can be very politically challenging, but I would emphasize that don't let the lack of action at the US federal level trick you into thinking that not much is happening worldwide. In fact, new carbon markets are forming at the US state level. Prices in almost all existing carbon markets worldwide have spiked dramatically over the last few years. So, for example, a carbon allowance in the European Union's emissions trading system now trades at close to 100 euros per ton, which is up from 10 euros in 2018. And likewise, prices in the California market, in the regional greenhouse gas initiative in the northeastern US have also spiked. And I actually think that's a very big deal, because at those prices, especially in the European Union, it seriously pays off to invest in clean tech, to move away from more carbon intensive projects. And it also means that climate regulation can be a huge opportunity for new jobs and industries and innovation. I also wanted to add that the EU carbon market is very exciting. I encourage everyone to keep a close eye on that. It may be a signpost of what's going to happen in other countries. For example, the Europeans are including a border tax now, in which CO2 emissions, even from imports, in the production process that happened outside of the EU, are now being taxed. So the European rules are starting to affect companies worldwide. To me, those are policy developments that are really at the heart of accountable capitalism. So I personally see ESG investing as kind of a purely rational risk-return trade-off by investors, where financial markets simply price the current, but also their expectations about future environmental regulation, like carbon pricing. And I expect that carbon markets will continue to grow, and therefore that investing in carbon intensive projects will become increasingly risky.
Thanks, Arthur. I think all of us who are drawn into this space, I think we have to be optimists. We have to believe in the power of system level change. But in my opening comments, I highlighted a number of reasons to be a little bit concerned about whether our optimism might be ahead of the reality. Do we really have 35 trillion or $50 trillion of assets, or do we have 2? And is 2 enough? Are corporations really embedding sustainability into their DNA, into their incentives, into their strategies, into their products, or is it more talk? And in the consulting space, what really is the demand for sustainability and long-term value consulting, especially in periods of some economic uncertainty and economic upheaval, such as we're facing today? I think we'd all agree that despite our optimism, we'd like to see more rapid change and more rapid progress. So what can we do? What can our peers in the corporate sector, in the consulting space, in the financial space, and in academic space or in the policy space do to accelerate progress towards accountable capitalism? How should we be discussing the problem, framing it? What do we need to explain to different managers, different clients, different asset owners, and who should be doing that explaining? Let's start with the corporate sector. Vivi, what is it that we need to explain to CEOs, to frontline managers, to workers? How do we better make the case for more holistic change, such as took place in Unilever? And how do we make sure Unilever stays the course after its leadership has changed?
I usually reflect on that by thinking if the last 40 or 50 decades are going to take us to the next 50 decades. And I think much in line with the AI kind of movement that we have now, and where we're really seeing the future through the lenses of analytics, and where more historical data is not really being used because we're producing so much of it. And our systems in general, they're very young, both democratic systems and accounting systems. Just the capitalism was sort of born in the 1970s, and most of those tools to assess all of these are still dated by then. So what I see is a lot of opportunities in how we're going to, adapt all of this. And I think with analytic tools and a lot of the scenario planning, we're going to have very different conversations in the boardrooms as to what really the impacts and the scenarios are, with different externalities, whether that is climate or social inequality. And I wanted to touch base on that because we often talk very, very much on the environmental aspect of ESG. But one thing and one data point that I keep always very present is that on the social angle, from the matrix of the ESG, less than 20% really are being reported. And those that are being reported are almost optional. So what we're saying is human capital, reporting on the basis of human capital, people, which is what, according to many surveys, is the #1 priority for Americans. Just to give an example, we want people to care for workers. This is not even a mandatory thing to be disclosed. So for asset managers, even assessing the health of a business in terms of their externalities. And now, thankfully, we have so many pricing and accounting tools for that. So I think thanks to technology, we will be able to simulate scenarios on portfolios for real. Because the difficult thing is not to innovate moving forward. Many companies, of course, are innovating. And the good news is that there's a lot happening. The question is how we're going to retrofit assets. We don't often talk about that. And moving forward, yes, but then what about assets and the transition? And I think what gives me hope, Vit, is that there is everything to do. We have to reshape our economy in so many ways, and we have to just, put aside a bit of the noise unnecessarily, because there isn't much space for that when data and everything is telling us the right direction. And that pays off. So I think what is going to happen is there's going to be a lot of innovation and new industries, new jobs, new economies, going towards what really we need to do in terms of adaptation. And that is going to happen across all industries. So that is very exciting. How to demonstrate that to shareholders? Well, we have to stress test a portfolio. Can you continue to produce your product or service at this pace in the next 5 to 10 years? And we know the answer is no. A lot of procurement officers don't really sleep at night because they know their commodities, depend to a lot of these fragilities. And we're not talking 5 to 10 years from now. We're talking 3 years from now. So these are things that are going to accelerate very much needed rapid change. And we will see which companies are reacting or being proactive to all of this anyway to thrive on business.
Monica, from your consulting clients, are you hearing that kind of demand for the analytical tools, the ability to model these scenarios? What would be your own advice on how consultants and strategists more broadly can accelerate the pace of change? How much of it is analysis, looking at the opportunity versus something else?
Yeah, so to answer that question directly, I would say that that our clients do have demand for analytical tools that demonstrate progress, but I think more importantly, it's actually working with our clients to demonstrate that embarking on this transformation journey, because it is a transformation journey, it does require significant change across all aspects of the organization, is not separate from other considerations. How do you manage your supply chain? How do you deliver against performance expectations? This is core to the business. And I think for us, it's mostly about integrating this lens into that transformation journey. Now, once you've got into that point and clients are with you on that journey, yes, obviously better data and tech matters. Achieving operational efficiencies matters, being able and more readily being able to report on this matters. But I think the first challenge for consulting companies is to make sure that they're working with clients to essentially underscore the point that approaching these expectations this way actually builds resilience and ability to react to a highly volatile and changing environment. I would just add that consulting companies have a few other things that they can do well. I mean, given that we work across sectors and we surface tremendous insights, we're uniquely positioned to essentially share best practices, go through this learning curve, because it is a learning curve for all companies involved, and co-develop and align around common standards when it comes to getting this right. So I think there's quite a lot that consulting companies can do to share those learnings and allow us to be better prepared as we move through this together and with clients. And I would say the last piece is that we all need to be taking our own medicine. So at EY, we're a 395,000 person organization with locations in every region of the globe. And we too need to drive changes, whether that be through governance and change initiatives across the organization, get to better data and reporting. And this translates into kind of meaningful changes in how we work, how we use energy, how much we travel, how we develop our people. And a lot of the work that we're doing right now is moving on that journey and kind of building a different level of responsiveness to these demands, which I think we all are going through together. So I'll leave that there.
Thanks, Monica. And Jennifer, let's turn over to the investor side. And in particular, how can we get asset owners to see the case for what we're describing here, for the transformative opportunities, and to look in a more nuanced way, perhaps, at the opportunities and risks of accountable capitalism than they do now? What can be done to accelerate change from the investor side?
Yeah, I mean, I think from the investor perspective, being able to separate out what we see as causal and economic and sharing stories and getting alignment and spending time on that, talking about it, but then acknowledging that on the human capital side, the research and the data is further behind, which doesn't mean it's not important, but it's like we can't have a one-stop shop. You can't push a button and it's magic. So I think from education continues to be incredibly important. It takes time. And when we think about the E and the S and the G, from a governance perspective, we know governance always matters. And so I think we can be very disciplined, whether you're an investor like we are and we're investing on behalf of others. How a company behaves in governance is really important. Tesla's a great example where they have built a process that is a beautiful engineering process that takes us down the road very quickly and creates competition on battery electric vehicles, right? But there are moments in time where if Elon Musk is running that company, you could give them a very negative grade on governance. And so it's important, I think, for investors to look at each company and look at governance. There's a lot of things we can observe on that. And there's a lot of research to back up what good and what bad governance looks like. So that could be very factual. It could be very data-based. It correlates with long-term returns. Then if you come over on the social and human capital side, you have to use slightly more crude tools, for lack of a better way to describe it. What we can do quickly is say, doesn't it matter? Don't you want to know if two companies that are in the same industry, one will win and one will lose because one does a better job with workers and community? Of course you want to know that as an asset owner or as the investor investing on behalf of the asset owner. But I think in that example, we have to support more research, more studies. We have to put more pressure on public companies to disclose people data so that we can then do the work to, again, make it factual and causal. And so I guess what I would say is we have to acknowledge that different types of insight are maybe on a slightly different kind of path or curve here. And there are some CEOs and boards that are super comfortable and understand the governance conversation. There are companies that don't like to touch the people and the human capital. And we as investors have to kind of push that conversation forward. And we have to start by, let's get the data, and then we can look at the results. And I also think that the market needs to take a look at, particularly in the US market, where we put ESG investment and funds over here, and then we put core and regular over here. And I think the best investors realize that doesn't make that much sense for two main reasons. One, a lot of the research in the last 10 years has proved that if you divest from a big public company, and this is particularly relevant probably in the energy space, if you divest from Exxon and Chevron and fossil fuel companies, you then have no vote, you have no voice in what those companies do. It doesn't actually turn off their capital spigot. And so the original idea around divestment wasn't primarily for values bias. It was because we thought we would starve the companies of capital. That's not the case. And so we're seeing more people be open and learning about an approach where you actually hold the companies, and then you have more control to work with the companies on having good governance and good capital allocation. And in this kind of energy space, as Arthur suggested, you'll have some small new companies, but it's very attractive for everybody, for the kind of big legacy energy companies to do better capital allocation and to be looking at how they make money in green and transition businesses. So there's a lot out there, but I think it's our job as investors, one, to do some of the work for clients, but two, to try to simplify these conversations and make it sort of feel achievable to the other people that we're talking about.
Yeah, so Jennifer, we've got a couple of questions coming in the chat that speak to some of these issues, and maybe just take a pause from a conversation to turn to a question raised by Alexis. You mentioned the importance of data, of transparency, of assessing the business case using data that may not be available. There's certainly a lot of disclosure frameworks and regulations that are being introduced, particularly the new European Union directives and maybe the SEC coming forward later this year with new directives on climate disclosure in the US. Some companies are developing their own standards. Each of the consultancies are offering, including EY, are offering different ways of measuring total value or long-term value. How should companies focus their efforts in terms of reporting? What's the most important data to disclose? What guidance do you have as someone assessing a company's efforts to achieve long-term value on what they should report and how?
Yeah, I mean, if I start with that one and take it from a kind of a U.S. lens, I think Europe is it's much more regimented about what you have to disclose, right? And there, let me just leave it at it's much more regimented framework. I think my advice to companies that are more in the U.S. or North American market is like, what business you're in, and so there's a top level of, from a governance perspective. Do you have incentives that are appropriate for the short term and are appropriate for you to win and beat competitors and drive very healthy growth over time? And the over time piece is really important. So one at a governance level, it's a relevant question for everybody. And then I think on the where to focus, given the overwhelming number of frameworks and kind of different development levels of different kinds of data, is sort of what business are you in, right? So if you're a major pharmaceutical company, there's probably something you have to tell us about improving the quality of human life. There's probably also something you have to tell us about environmental impact and how you treat some of the compounds as things come together from an environmental perspective. And so I honestly think that the simpler approach to governance always matters, followed by what industry are you in, and what are your largest potential negative or positive externalities, and start there and really like dive in and become an expert there, and then, you know, keep going on all the rest of the things that you could be looking at.
Yeah, I think that's really critical. We can get bogged down in 1,400 reporting requirements from the EU and lose sight of the 2 or 3 that are really driving material outcomes. So couldn't agree more. And some of our own research at the ESG initiative really emphasizes that as well, as the importance of weighting these factors by how important they are for the P&L. So let's go back to the policy environment. Arthur, what do you see as the best hope for accelerating change in this? Is it more disclosure? Is it more pricing of carbon? What can we do to accelerate change from the public sector?
Yeah, let me talk a little bit about like how policy could perhaps be improved, because I think one extremely important issue is that it's actually something that's often ignored or at least poorly understood, is that governments can reach some environmental target either efficiently and cheaply, or in a very, very suboptimal way with unintended consequences. And I think that's the core of my own research. It's an issue that unfortunately governments tend to choose the more expensive solution. So for example, if you want to reduce emissions from cars, just tax gasoline. But here in the United States, we keep gas taxes minimal and choose a very complicated set of fuel economy standards, which then end up favoring the production of trucks and SUVs. And the sad end result is that it ends up costing society and taxpayers a lot more per ton of CO2 saved than the gas taxes in Europe. Another example, right, if you want to reduce emissions from electricity, tax carbon. But instead, the US Inflation Reduction Act pays massive subsidies to green products, which certainly helps a bit, but it fails to tax the fossil electricity directly. And somewhat sadly to economists, the word carbon pricing is conspicuously absent in any of the Biden administration's policies. Now, of course, it's a convenient excuse to say, well, it's not possible politically. But the end result is, again, that these policies like the Inflation Reduction Act are much more expensive for taxpayers per ton of carbon saved than, say, a European-style emissions trading system. Now, I would say, honestly, to be really open about that, economists have become a little tired of pointing this out. Like, we know it, the EPA knows it, many politicians know it, but you simply don't get elected on a platform of raising gas taxes. So I think where corporate ESG leaders can have real impact is in saying, well, if you truly care about improving the state of the environment, you have a voice to demand smart and effective policies, and spend your lobbying dollars on a few politicians who advocate for such policies, right? They do exist also in the United States. And I think their influence would be amplified if CEOs and boards would rally behind them.
So a couple more questions that came in, just building on this conversation. First, for Vivi from Russell, who asked, it's great that we have all these tools, but how do we fight back against the defensiveness against accountable capitalism? And what is it that we can do to have maybe more leadership in this space? Or how important is leadership beyond just having the tools, having the systems, running the scenarios? What else is necessary to disarm defensiveness against accountable capitalism? Vivi?
I think that's the million-dollar question. It's leadership. I think it's the moral compass missing in all of this, because even from a monetary perspective, and I don't like starting with saying that, but the economy is estimated in $1.4 quadrillion. Okay, that's even, I don't know how many times bigger than the global GDP estimated. So it is clearly not lack of money. We know we have a lot of technologies in place that are going to help us to get there, and things that don't exist yet that very likely we will co-create it. I think it's the missing piece is the aha moment that this is a non-negotiable, with or without the markets, with or right side or left side. I think we're talking about externalities that are a reality. We want and we need clean water, clean air, and many other things that are required for this economy to be moving. So I think the conversation is a bit more existential bit. I know the question is coming more from what are the tangible things, but related to what Monica and Jen said, education is a critical component of over-investing in this. So we can uneducate and re-educate ourselves and all the multi-stakeholders, and starting, of course, with decision makers in the front line, which are CEOs, C-suite members, board members, who are really, really asking for all of this. I mean, the numbers are proving this in leadership training and new ways to upskill workers across different areas. And this is a very, very important thing as well. What took us here is not going to take us there. So even systems like the education system is going to have to readapt for the needs of all of these corporations and future talent, because that's another key challenge that we have right now. Do we have the right skills at scale from a human capital perspective to take us to this transition that we're talking about? And so it's going to be a mix between how we manage the human capital ourselves, especially now in an era with so much automation and where jobs and skills are changing so much. So we have to adapt with these timings. Where I think we're in a very Darwin situation, in where we just have to adapt, and we have to see a lot of these things are real big opportunities. We're talking about portfolio shifts. We're talking about cultural mindsets. We're talking about change management in corporations, in where you need a strong guidance. I think before there was a question specifically about Unilever. How did the Unilevers did it? Well, with the help of a lot of people. It's not one company alone. I believe that strategic partnerships are going to be absolutely vital. No company alone can do it. This is not about the success or challenges one organization could have. So education, leadership, and holding the hand, of course, of the decision makers that privately or publicly do acknowledge this is a very, very serious problem, but as well a big opportunity. And if we lower a bit the barriers and the language of capitalism or ESG, I think it comes down to a much more basic existential opportunity that we have on how we actually do business.
Thanks, Viv. So I want to have one last question before we open it up more fully to the audience, and we give them the rest of the time. So maybe if we can keep the answers to this really short. Final question is, what's the most important thing that you wish people would learn, understand, maybe make a part of their toolkit to drive impact and become leaders of accountable capitalism? What's the one gap that you think if people could absorb, people could learn, they could really accelerate their change? So let's try to just have a rapid fire series of answers. First from Jennifer.
I think it's not to do ESG on the side. I think it's to assume the E and the S and the G is data and material, and kind of push it into the core of how people think about things.
Great. And Monica, you gave us the 5 best practices earlier, but what else beyond, maybe going another layer into those 5? Effie was asking for a little bit more as to what those best practices are, and tell us more about what you wish people would do, or what tools they could grab hold of to realize those 5 best practices.
Yeah, so first of all, I just want to echo Jen's comment. I absolutely agree that for this to be successful, you really need to embed your ESG or sustainability lens into the core of how you do business. I think beyond that, there are a few other lessons learned. I mean, I think that there is no silver bullet, right? So you can define your governance, you can be clear about stakeholder expectations, you can embed this into your strategy and operations and report well and have all the data analytics and tools to support it. But I think we all need to recognize that this is a journey. It's a learning process. Like any other transformation, it's complex. It requires alignment across not only a number of different functions within the business, but also it requires cooperation across companies within a sector and across public and private partnerships. So I think that the recognition that it's a journey, we'll get some things right, we'll get some things wrong, but we're collectively in this together. And to the extent that more adopt the mindset Vivi talked about, which is it is an existential challenge for all of us, but that, if we partner, we will do better on this journey. I think those are the key to making it real. And I think that trial and error, or taking a proof of concept, test quickly, learn, iterate, and get better at it, is probably the best tactical advice we could give.
Okay, Vivi, what does people in the C-suite need to know? What's the one thing holding them back? Vivi, I think you're muted. Sorry.
Thank you. Sorry. I want to echo what Arthur mentioned before about systems thinking. I think we, in the past, we have been taught to analyze from cost to all of this in a very siloed way. Everything has unintended consequences because everything is hyper-connected. So if we start seeing all of this from business cases to accounting assessments to corporate strategies and the implications of the interdependencies of the systems, is when we're really going to have much sharper decisions on portfolios and investments. So it's almost like a war strategy backwards. And I do put a lot of emphasis in the scenario planning, because with technology, we are being able to do things now in minutes that before would naturally take 2 or 3 years of consultancy approach, just to give you an example. So that is one thing that is going to change. It is already changing fundamentally how investments and corporates allocate a lot of their assets. The second one, and that should be actually the first one, is people, people, people. I don't think there is a company with purpose. There's people with purpose. There's leaders with purpose, and there's leaders that and multi-stakeholders that actually see that the missing equation as well is what is the role of the human capital in all of this, right? And from all different angles. And I think that is a very, very big missing part of the equation. And over-investing in education, because what took us here is not going to take us there. So we're just going to have to reinvent a lot of this. And we have a lot of frameworks in place that are actually working. So I think we don't have to boil the ocean either. There's a lot of things that are working. I think from an ESG perspective, we have come a tremendous way. And untapping to those frameworks is very important because it's just the beginning.
Are there, what are your thoughts on the one thing that you wish people would learn, people could understand, either in your classroom or if you're talking to policymakers?
Well, I think it's crucial for investors, consultants, strategists to really understand how climate risks affect prices and financial markets and might change long-term corporate strategies. And I would say that climate risk pricing is real. Like, for example, take the housing market. There's some really interesting research by some of my colleagues here at Wharton who studied the housing market in Florida and showed that houses that are in high flood risk areas transacted 19% less and sold for 5% less than very similar houses in low flood risk areas. Another example, right? If the European $100 carbon pricing were to happen in the US, it's really important to understand like how that would dramatically shift the profitability of different sectors, and good strategists and leaders need to understand why and how financial markets respond and how to be prepared for that. And I think, I just want to end by mentioning proudly that these topics feature really highly in the courses that we teach here at Wharton and also in our ESG executive education offerings.
Thanks, Arthur. So we need to experiment. We need to embed ESG into the core. We need more system level thinking. We need people who have a sense of purpose, that are willing to drive this experimentation and integration. And we all need to understand the role that externalities play in this broader system that companies are embedded in. So now let's turn to a couple questions from the audience. First, from Golaba Krishnan, boards play a critical role in this process that we're describing. They assess companies' performance, they hold firms accountable, they balance and help companies focus. What can we do to incentivize boards and to mobilize boards to think more centrally and focus more on the link between ESG and profitability? I think, Jennifer, given Engine Number One's role in toppling 3 board members at ExxonMobil, it makes sense to start with you in that question.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. I think, again, it's the strategy with boards is to kind of break it down into where they are starting from and how they think about things. And so the proxy fight that we waged with Exxon was about, governance. So from a capital allocation perspective, if you're a fossil fuel company and potentially fossil fuel kind of tapers off at some point, what is the business that comes after that? So, like, are you being disciplined about a midterm fossil fuel business? Are you doing third-party methane verification? That's easy. The technology exists. And then are you building a green business post fact? And that work with them, we had to, have a proxy fight in that case. But then getting the new people on the board, they have been better on capital allocation. They have built a green business. Their stock has been 70% above Chevron since that campaign. And I like that example because that was a board that was particularly adverse to thinking about what were they missing and how to think about externalities. But working with that board or any boards, and most boards, it's much easier to work with because they know that their business changes through time. Is sort of meeting them where they are a little bit on how does the company keep up with the change. So if you're in the energy industry, it's transforming. And how do you have people on the board that keep up with the change? Do you have people on the board that can manage through transitions? Do you have people on the board that have the vision to be able to take the company forward as things change? And so I think, again, breaking it down into what business is the company in, where can they do better from a governance perspective, are very simple and accessible ways to start a conversation. And then you can work through the different data around impact on community and workers, and how you have great workers who feel good, which makes you outcompete a competitor. So I do think using the competitive and how do you win as a business through time is a really easy place to start these conversations. And then you can build from that.
Great. So we had a question for Vivi from Emily. If I can paraphrase, Vivi, several times you've made a stronger moral or normative case for leadership in this area. And Emily's asking, how do we evolve leaders' sight so that the aha moral imperative moment you're talking about is self-evident? How do we get them to see that faster? And Emily goes on to say that as she's been thinking about it, she's really landed on the fact that an evidence-based or a data-driven approach is really the right way to help connect the dots. Do you agree, or what helps leaders invoke and harness the power of the moral imperative as part of this process?
I think we're going to need all type of different approaches. We're going to need from activism movements who will steer, unfortunately, a lot of group of leaders who either deny or are blocking the change. And these will be externalities that we will see from students, employees, countries, and we're already seeing that. Because what we're talking about is countries that in 40 years, entire GDP will be wiped off. We know the estimations of the global economy being impacted if we don't decarbonize the economy properly, of losing more than 20% global GDP. But that means 100% for some countries. So I think we're underestimating the social disruption that we could have, coupled with other very big externalities that we're seeing in our democratic systems and other angles. So it's a long answer, Vits, to say that we're going to need from extra education and frameworks helping these leaders demonstrate that there's many different ways of doing business in a more responsible and resilient way. From a fiduciary responsibility, I think that the heat will increase. I mean, I don't think we can have from board members a lot of the same rules that we have until now. And we've seen that in Europe and other regions. I can only expect that increasing. So there's going to be the aha internally that a leader can have, whether that is based from experiences in his life, her life, or the organization, or because these factors are already impacting the business model and they're craving for that. And a lot of the changes that we might see will come from the employee movement. And we are seeing spurs of that across different regions. And in the US, these might be a decade where a lot of those things are going to have a catalytic point. So what I'm offering is just a cocktail of different situations that are going to accelerate the need for that. And I do see that a lot of the board members and people in current leadership positions are really upskilling themselves because they understand that it's the never-ending game. We just simply have to adapt and embrace this constant change and therefore the leadership style and moral compass within.
Monica, I think a question for you, just on the role of supply chains and all of this. And we're in a period where we're going from talking about decoupling, maybe de-risking the US-China supply chain, trying to think about what's being reshored or what's being friendshored, but then balancing some of these ESG challenges. I mean, recent days, the New York Times has run some great exposés about the pros and cons of nickel mining in Indonesia. On the one hand, we need more nickel for batteries. On the other hand, we need to be less dependent on China, but it's Chinese-owned mines in Indonesia. How do we think about the role of supply chain reconfiguration in all of this, and how should companies be thinking about the restructuring of their supply chain? Is that playing a large role in some of your consulting engagements? And if so, what are some of the early insights?
Yeah, so complex set of issues you raised, and or whoever raised the question. So yes, supply chain risks, whether those be human rights related risks, environmental risks, or other risks, are very much kind of a part of the kinds of questions that our clients come to us. But with, I would say they equally come to us with kind of, how do you build supply chain resilience? How do you think about geopolitical risks as well? So I think in this case, it is quite important that when you think about everything from sourcing through your supply chain management, you're embedding within that not just a cost optimization or resilience lens, but also an ESG lens, environmental, human rights, and otherwise. I would say it's fairly uneven in terms of whether companies are thinking holistically about those risks. But I think that if you take a step back and realize the extent to which we are relying upon supply chains that have inherent fragility, taking a broad stakeholder lens is going to be quite helpful. And you can see, I won't name names in terms of companies, but you can see fairly striking examples where a failure to recognize the risks across your supply chain come back and pose a challenge to the company with respect to their customers and buying habits. So I would say it's an evolution. And I think this is actually going to be something that's increasingly present on the horizon.
Okay. We had a great wildcard question coming in from Gloria that I'm just going to throw out to the panel to see if anyone wants to tackle it. One of the emerging issues after ESG that has emerged very centrally into the conversation in business schools and the broader policy environment, and I think in the ESG space, is artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, autonomous AI, and there are all sorts of ways in which these two play together. It affects our ability to analyze the data, build the system level models. But then we also have companies like NVIDIA, which used to be thought of as being an ESG kind of angel, suddenly being in the midst of potential developments of autonomous AI, algorithms, others that could really pose real risks to workers and even system level risks. So what role does AI play in the regulation of AI as well, if we turn to Arthur, in the ESG conversation or in the accountable capitalism conversation? Does it make things easier in terms of holding firms accountable, or does it add a whole new layer of risk and challenges? Anyone want to volunteer to take that first? Do we have a volunteer on the panel? Go ahead. Please.
Arthur, please. No, Arthur, regulation. Yes, please.
Arthur.
Well, I would say that I think there's indeed a lot of almost, there's excitement, but also nervousness, right, around this. I think especially when I come from the environmental angle, we simply don't know yet what exactly, the full potential of these developments is going to be for example, the environment. I think there is tremendous enthusiasm about things like what if autonomous transportation that could be done more efficiently with lower emissions, about smart homes where these sorts of technologies could help make decisions for people to save energy without having to think about it. So there's a lot of potential. At the same time, I think there's real worries, but this is not my expertise in the ESG debate, about the people part, right? There's a lot of worry about jobs being lost, and we simply don't know where that's going. I think regulations are always following developments. That's kind of an inherent weakness of regulation, and this is exciting to follow. But I think regulation will always happen with a bit of a lag.
Okay, I think we have time for one final question, and I'm going to pose it to each of the panelists. I think very consistent with the line of inquiry we've had. Martha asks about the importance of corporate acknowledgement and accounting for the total material impacts that companies have on all their stakeholders. And should we be trying to make more progress in corporations voluntarily disclosing that? We'll start with Jennifer. Jennifer, is that something that you would push for in your engagement, sort of a total value reporting system from the companies with which you're working? And I'll work through the rest, starting with Jennifer.
Yeah, so I think that our experience with it is that it differs a little bit industry to industry, and the data and the amount of research to support how you use data can be wildly different on, say, water use versus emissions versus human capital. And so we're not a fan of adding it up and creating a score. We're a fan of a huge amount of transparency of underlying data, just because we think that's where we all are, and we get more information on understanding where companies are on different parts of their business versus having it rolled up as a score. But yes, one of our products is a large cap product where we are very transparent on how we vote every year, and that's one of the things that we always do. Is like more data is good in most of these cases.
Monica, what about you? Is EY helping companies doing more total impacts valuation and reporting?
Yeah, so EY was part of the Embankment Project for Inclusive Capitalism, helping to develop a framework for measuring long-term value and delivery against expectations for stakeholders. Working together with asset owners, asset managers, and many corporates. We then went on to partner with the Big Four and the IBC to develop a set of baseline stakeholder metrics we could all rally around. I think we got to about 120 companies self-reporting, and obviously standards continue to evolve. So our point of view is to try to stimulate as much transparent reporting as possible. I can say that even in internal discussions, it takes pushing, and and I'm sure Viv and others can appreciate this. It takes pushing in terms of how far can you go in the spirit of transparency. How much can you lead by example and hope that others follow? But this is an ongoing set of discussions, both internally and together with our clients.
Well, I think we've come to the end of the hour. I want to thank each of my panelists for being leaders in the space and for sharing that leadership perspective with us in this conversation, or this set of dispatches from the front line of accountable capitalism. I also want to thank my colleagues at the Wharton School for helping organize this event and at LinkedIn Live. I hope that you found the conversation stimulating, and that you'll look to more insights and leadership, both from the panelists and also from esg.wharton.upenn.edu, where the ESG initiative tries to push forward academically rigorous and practically relevant insights onto accountable capitalism and ESG more broadly. Thanks very much.